Welcome to the History Maps podcast. We are looking at a small band of early humans huddled inside a limestone cave.
Right, and the air outside is biting. It's carrying the harsh winds of an ice age that has essentially locked down most of the European continent under massive, unlivable glaciers.
Yeah, and these people who are looking out from what we now call the Koba Cave, they are standing on a piece of land that is going to become one of the most violently contested, culturally layered, and, well, strategically vital territories in human history.
They're standing on the Crimean Peninsula.
Exactly. And that geographic paradox, that is our mission for this deep dive.
Because the geography of that specific landmass, it basically dictates everything that follows over the next 80,000 years.
Right. Today we are exploring the pre-1900 history of Crimea. We're drawing from a stack of historical texts, archaeological records, and geopolitical analyses.
And we really want to look impartially at the shifting borders, trace the demographics and understand the mechanics of how and why the population of this peninsula changed so drastically over thousands of years.
Because to understand the complex demographic shifts of the 19th century, you have to go back to a time when Crimea was a sanctuary during the Ice Age.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at a topographical map of the Black Sea, Crimea hangs down from the northern coast, right?
Yeah.
It's suspended by this thread of land so incredibly narrow.
The Perekop Isthmus.
Exactly. The Perekop Isthmus, which is only about 5 to 7 kilometers wide in some places.
Wow, that is narrow.
Yeah, so it makes the peninsula almost function as a geographic paradox. It's an island that isn't quite an island. It is connected to the vast, endless Eurasian steppe, yet it thrusts deep into the maritime world of the Black Sea.
So it's a bridge, basically.
Yes. And to understand the massive demographic terraforming that occurs later, we have to establish the baseline of who was there first and why they stayed.
Right, going back to that image of the cave.
The archaeological record for human habitation here is incredibly dense. We have Neanderthal remains excavated at Koba, which date back roughly 80,000 years before present.
80,000 years.
Yeah. And we see continuous layers of occupation at sites like Starocell, which is around 46,000 years before present, and Barankaya III, about 30,000 years before present.
Which puts us directly in the last glacial maximum.
Exactly. Much of northern Europe is just a frozen wasteland at this point.
But the Black Sea, it sort of acts as a thermal battery, right?
It does. It moderates the climate just enough to create an ecological sanctuary. It provided this temperate pocket where these early populations could actually survive the deep freeze.
And the sources even suggest that when the ice eventually began to recede, populations from this specific Crimean refuge expanded outward. They actually played a role in repopulating north-central Europe.
Yeah, it acts as a biological incubator. But, as the climate warms and we transition into the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, the landscape of human settlement shifts.
It goes from mere survival to complex societal organization.
Right. By the 3rd millennium BCE, the Yamna culture arrives.
And who were the Yamna?
These are pastoralist populations that historians strongly associate with the Proto-Indo-European language groups.
Okay, so they arrived by the 3rd millennium BCE.
Yeah, and this is the exact moment when the physical geography of Crimea begins to, heavily dictate human behavior.
Because the peninsula is sliced into two totally distinct worlds. Down in the south, you have the Crimean Mountains.
Which, they aren't the Himalayas, but they are rugged.
Right. They're dense, and they hug the southern coastline, creating hidden valleys and defensible cliffs.
And then north of those mountains, taking up perhaps 3/4 of the landmass, you have the arid, flat steppes.
Just an ocean of grass.
An ocean of grass that bleeds seamlessly across the Perekop Isthmus and out into the greater Eurasian mainland.
So the environment completely bifurcated the societies living there.
It did. By the 8th century BCE, the historical record identifies the indigenous or autochthonous population of those southern mountains as the Tori.
The Tori. And the archaeological evidence for them is known as the Koba culture.
Yes, the Koba culture.
Let's dig into the Tori, because the ancient texts paint a fairly intense picture of them.
They definitely do.
We have the physical evidence, right? What archaeologists call cyst cemeteries.
Right. And for a listener who might not know, a cyst cemetery is essentially a grave dug into the earth and meticulously lined with flat stone slabs.
Almost like creating a box.
Exactly, a stone box, which often held multiple burials and, handmade pottery and bronze jewelry.
But the textual evidence from Greek historians, it frames them less as artisans and more as this terrifying obstacle to maritime trade.
Well, the Greeks viewed them entirely through the lens of maritime vulnerability. The mountains provided the Tauri with highly defensible redoubts.
Right, they could just watch the coast.
Exactly. From these elevated hidden positions, they could monitor the Black Sea coastline. When a merchant ship was forced close to the rocky shore by bad weather, the Tauri would launch organized piracy raids.
And the Greek texts claim that the Tauri sacrificed captured sailors,
They
right?
do. They claim they sacrificed them to a virgin goddess. This historical friction eventually filtered into Greek mythology, heavily inspiring the stories of Iphigenia and Orestes in Taurus.
Okay, so in the south, you have heavily fortified, piracy-driven mountain dwellers.
Yes.
But if you walk just a few dozen miles north, you hit the grass and the culture completely flips. The steppe was dominated by nomads.
Right. First, we see the Sumerians around the 9th century BCE,
Okay.
and then they are pushed out or absorbed by the Scythians by the 7th century BCE.
And the Scythians were an Iranian-speaking nomadic powerhouse.
They were, because the steppe, it requires absolute mobility. The Scythians mastered equestrian warfare and pastoralism.
They didn't build stone cities,
No, their architecture was focused on the dead. They built kurgans.
which are mound graves.
Right, massive earthen burial mounds, sometimes towering meters into the air, which obviously required immense labor to construct.
And the items pulled out of those kurgans, particularly the ones clustered near the Kerch Strait on the eastern tip of Crimea, are staggering.
Oh, absolutely.
We are talking about highly intricate gold artifacts depicting animal combat. We're talking bronze battle axes, spear points, complex horse trappings.
It tells the story of a martial society whose entire existence was tied to the horse and the vast horizons of the Eurasian steppe.
Okay, so you have two completely divergent survival strategies sharing one peninsula.
Yes.
You have the agrarian and piratical mountain culture and the mobile pastoralist steppe culture. But here is where I want to push back on the idea of environmental determinism.
Okay, go ahead.
Because it is tempting to look at a map and say the geography acted like an ancient sorting hat, right?
Mhm.
Forcing people into two incompatible boxes where they never mixed.
Right.
But human beings aren't water. We don't just pool where gravity tells us to. Did these groups essentially remain isolated in their respective zones?
They absolutely did not. Proximity always forces interaction, whether that's through conflict or commerce. Over centuries, the boundary between the mountains and the steppe became permeable.
So they blended.
Yeah. By the 1st century, we see profound cultural intermingling. Ancient writers even coined the term Tauro-Scythians to describe these hybrid communities.
So the Tauri and Scythians mixed.
They did. The Tauri adopted Scythian weaponry and customs. Meanwhile, segments of the Scythian population actually transitioned away from pure nomadism.
They settled down.
Yes. They built permanent administrative centers, the most famous being Scythian Neapolis, which is located near modern-day Simferopol, right on that boundary line between the mountains and the plains.
But just as that localized balance of power was stabilizing, a massive external shock arrived.
Right.
Because while the Tauri and the Scythians were adapting to the land, maritime powers across the Black Sea were looking at Crimea's coastline and realizing its massive economic potential.
And that brings us to the 7th century BCE, when the Greeks arrive.
So what were the push factors for the Greeks? Why did they leave home to come to the Black Sea?
Well, it was deeply tied to their own domestic crises. Greek city-states were suffering from severe overpopulation.
Okay.
Yeah, they had resource scarcity, political infighting. They desperately needed secure access to grain, timber, and fish to feed their cities.
So colonists from places like Miletus and Heraclea Pontica began launching expeditions across the sea.
And the settlements they established were incredibly durable. In 610 BCE, Greek colonists founded Panticapaeum on the eastern edge of the peninsula, which is modern-day Kerch.
610 BCE, and the historical record indicates this is the oldest continuous urban settlement in all of Eastern Europe.
It is. Then, on the western coast, around 422 BCE, colonists from Heraclea founded Chersonesus Taurica.
Chersonesus. And this provides a brilliant window into the mechanics of Greek colonization, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely. It operated as an independent republic with democratic institutions, which closely mirrored the political structure of its mother city. But the most vital component of Chersonesus was its agricultural zone, known as the Chora.
Okay, let's define the Chora, because it answers a question I have about how these colonies actually functioned.
Sure.
When we say the Greeks colonized Crimea, were they actually pushing deep into the interior, conquering Scythian territory and setting up a vast state? Or were these more like, fortified coastal strip malls existing just to buy grain from the nomads and ship it south.
It was much more systemic than a mere trading post. The core of Chersonesus covered over 50 square kilometers of land on the Heraclean Peninsula.
50 square kilometers.
Yeah. And the Greeks systematically divided this land into a rigid grid of identical agricultural plots.
So they were farming it themselves.
Exactly. They built stone walls, farmsteads, terraces. They were fundamentally re-engineering the coastal landscape for intensive, high-yield agriculture, specifically focused on wheat and viticulture.
So they weren't just buying from the locals.
No, they were creating their own localized industrial farming complex.
But the eastern side of the peninsula, around Pentacapium, that takes a different evolutionary path.
It does. Around 480 BCE, several of these Greek trading cities realized they were highly vulnerable to nomadic raids from the steppe.
So they federated.
Right. They united to form the Bosporan Kingdom, initially ruled by the Archinactid dynasty and later the Spartocids, starting in 438 BCE.
438 BCE.
And it is a fascinating political entity. Instead of engaging in a perpetual war of attrition with the Scythians, the Bosporan kings actively fostered a hybrid Greco-Scythian aristocracy.
We actually see the physical evidence of this in the burial mounds.
Yes, exactly.
So you open a Bosporan grave from this era, and you find classical Athenian pottery sitting right next to nomadic bronze arrowheads and Scythian horse gear.
It is a deliberate cultural synthesis, and that synthesis created stability. And of course, stability generated unprecedented wealth.
So they became an economic powerhouse.
A massive one. By integrating Greek maritime logistics with the agricultural output of the steppe, the Bosporan kingdom became the breadbasket of the ancient world.
Just how much grain are we talking about?
Well, under the Spartocid dynasty, historical records show they were exporting up to 2.1 million medimnoi of grain annually to Athens.
Okay, we need to translate that number for you listening. A medimnos was a Greek unit of volume.
Yeah.
So 2.1 million medimnoi is roughly equivalent to 80,000 metric tons of grain.
It's an astronomical amount.
It really is. That is enough food to sustain hundreds of thousands of people for an entire year. Crimea was functionally keeping the city of Athens alive.
Which made the peninsula a vital node in classical geopolitics. But extreme wealth inevitably attracts imperial attention.
Naturally.
Between 110 and 46 BCE, the region was absorbed by the Hellenistic kingdom of Pontus, ruled by Mithridates VI Eupator.
And Mithridates used the vast grain wealth of Crimea to fund his massive protracted wars against the expanding Roman Republic.
He did. But when Rome finally defeats Pontus, Crimea is pulled directly into the Roman orbit.
But Rome didn't just conquer it outright, did they?
No. By the 1st century CE, the geopolitical situation on the steppe shifts again. New waves of nomads, particularly the Sarmatians, are pushing west, pressuring the Crimean coast.
So the Bosporan kingdom realizes it cannot survive alone.
Right. So it essentially signs on as a Roman client state. And Rome's approach to Crimea was highly calculated. The empire needed the grain supply to remain uninterrupted.
But sending legions to conquer the endless Eurasian steppe.
It was a logistical nightmare. It was a war they could never definitively win, so they outsourced the border security.
They kept the Bosporan kings in power to manage the local politics.
Exactly. But Rome provided the military muscle to secure the ports. They established a permanent military camp called Carax on the southern coast.
And we have records of specific Roman legions there, right?
We do. We have records of detachments from the Legio Aetitalica and the Legio XS Claudia being stationed there. They built Roman baths, aqueducts, coastal fortresses.
It was a pragmatic, low-investment, high-return strategy for Rome.
Very much so. They projected power across the Black Sea and secured their supply chains without getting bogged down in the deep interior.
But Roman military might could not hold back the tide of human migration forever.
No, it couldn't. As we move into the 3rd century CE, the classical world begins to fragment. Entirely new ethnic groups come crashing into the peninsula.
And the first major wave involves Germanic peoples, specifically the Goths.
Yes, the Goths.
We are talking about East Germanic tribes, the Gruthungi, migrating all the way from the Baltic region down through modern-day Ukraine and slamming into Crimea.
And their arrival was devastating for the existing power structures. They pushed into the peninsula and completely destroyed Scythian Neapolis.
But rather than just passing through, a significant portion of these Gothic tribes pushed up into the Crimean mountains and stayed.
Right. They carved out their own polity, which becomes known as Gothia.
Gothia. And the capital was centered around a highland plateau known as Mangup, or Doros. But how did a Germanic tribe from the forests of northern Europe manage to survive and thrive for centuries, isolated in the Rocky Mountains of the Black Sea?
Well, they survived through aggressive adaptation and defensive geography. The Crimean Mountains are carved with these deep, fertile valleys known as cuestas.
Cuestas.
Yeah, and they are easily defended at their narrow entrances, but they're wide enough inside to support agriculture and livestock. The Goths leveraged this terrain perfectly.
So they adapted to the mountains.
They did, and over time, they underwent a fascinating cultural syncretism. They adopted Christianity due to the proximity of the Byzantine Empire.
But they kept their language.
They fiercely maintained their distinct East Germanic language. We actually have records of Crimean Gothic being spoken in those mountains all the way into the 16th century.
That is wild. Now, while the Goths locked down the mountains, the Roman Empire, which has now transitioned into the Byzantine Empire, was desperately holding on to the southwestern coastline.
Right. Emperor Justinian I, who ruled from 527 to 565, poured massive resources into fortifying Chersonesus.
Which the Byzantines simply called Cherson.
Yes, Cherson. Justinian's engineers constructed massive defensive walls, heavily fortified towers, and these impressive three-nave Christian basilicas.
They were attempting to build an impregnable fortress to withstand the chaotic churn of the steppe, which was now seeing incursions from the Huns and the Bulgars.
Exactly.
You know, the best way to visualize Byzantine Cherson is to think of West Berlin during the Cold War.
Oh, that's an interesting comparison.
Right. You have this small, highly advanced, deeply fortified outpost of a massive empire, and it's completely surrounded on all landward sides by shifting, often hostile nomadic powers.
Right. It's an island of Byzantine culture, surviving only because it can be constantly resupplied by sea.
Does that analogy hold up historically?
That analogy perfectly captures the strategic reality. The Byzantines were masters of grand strategy, and they understood that Cherson was their only listening post on the northern frontier.
So they need it for intel.
Exactly. In 841, they actually upgraded its status, formalizing it as the theme of Cherson.
And the theme was essentially a militarized province, right?
Correct. It was commanded by a strategos, a military governor, who possessed both civil and martial authority.
But he wasn't just a military commander.
No, the strategos wasn't there just to command soldiers on the walls. His primary job was intelligence gathering and diplomacy. The steppe was a highway for Turkic nomads, the Khazars, the Pechenegs, the Palavci in the 11th century.
And Byzantium needed early warning if those groups started moving toward Constantinople.
Exactly. Cherson managed the complex web of bribes, alliances, and trade that kept the nomads divided and distracted.
And that trade included the highly lucrative Byzantine slave trade.
Yes, unfortunately it did.
But the strategy of playing steppe nomads against each other from behind a wall, that ultimately fails to account for the rising power of the Slavic states to the north.
All right.
Which brings us to a specific event at Chersonesus that permanently alters the cultural trajectory of Eastern Europe.
Because the Kievan Rus had been interacting with Crimea for decades. In the 10th century, Prince Sviatoslav I of Kiev had already asserted control over the eastern side of the peninsula, establishing the Principality of Timutarakin near the Kerch Strait.
But the true pivot of history occurs in 989.
Right. Grand Prince Vladimir of Kiev marches his army south and lays siege to Chersonesus.
And the sources note he eventually captures the city by cutting off its water supply. But he doesn't just sack it and leave.
No, he uses the captured city as diplomatic leverage against the Byzantine emperor, Basil II.
And what does he demand?
He demands to marry the emperor's sister, Anna Porphyrogenita.
A marriage to a Byzantine princess.
Yes, a woman born in the purple. It was an unprecedented concession to a foreign ruler that the Byzantines considered a barbarian.
But Basil II desperately needed Vladimir's military assistance to quell an internal rebellion.
He did. So the political settlement required Vladimir to be baptized.
So he is baptized right there in the cathedral at Chersonesus. He marries the princess and returns to Kiev to mandate the Christianization of his entire realm.
Right. Crimea was the exact geographical conduit where the religious, architectural, and cultural DNA of the Byzantine Empire was physically injected into the Slavic world.
That is a monumental shift.
It was. But, you know, all of this localized geopolitics, the Byzantine diplomacy, the Gothic mountain fortresses, the Kievan Rus outposts, it was about to be rendered completely irrelevant.
Because in the 13th century, a military force arrived that could not be bribed, outmaneuvered, or walled out.
Mongols.
The Mongol Golden Horde sweeps across the Eurasian steppe. They hit the northern and central plains of Crimea and conquer the territory with terrifying speed.
And for the first time, the endless factions of the steppe are unified under a single, overwhelming military apparatus. The Mongols fundamentally altered the demographic makeup of the peninsula.
How did they integrate it?
Over the ensuing decades, the region was integrated into the administrative structure of the Mongol Empire as the Crimean Ulus.
And religion shifts, too.
Yes. Eventually, Islam became the state religion of the Golden Horde. And the assimilation of the various Turkic tribes with the Mongol conquerors formed the distinct ethnic and cultural nucleus of the people we now know as the Crimean Tatars.
But the Mongols were fundamentally a land-based empire, right?
Right.
They controlled the vast overland routes of the Silk Road, but they had very little interest in managing maritime trade fleets.
No, not at all.
And this creates a vacuum on the coast, which is quickly filled by Italian merchants.
Specifically, the Republic of Genoa. In the 1260s, they established a heavily fortified trading colony at Kaffa, which is modern-day Feodosia.
And Kaffa rapidly became the most vital economic hub in the Black Sea.
It did. The Genoese built massive stone walls, deep-water ports, and banking houses. They essentially linked the overland wealth of the Mongol Empire directly into the lucrative Mediterranean markets.
I have to stop and question the mechanics of this relationship, though, because on paper, it makes absolutely no sense.
How so?
Well, you have deeply Catholic, urban, capitalist Italian merchants living inside their walled coastal cities. And outside the walls, you have nomadic, Islamic, highly martial Mongol warriors controlling the steppe.
Right.
And the historical record shows they fought several brutal conflicts known as the Genoese-Mongol Wars, including the famous siege of Kaffa, where the Mongols catapulted plague-ridden corpses over the walls.
Yes, they did.
So how could they possibly maintain a functioning, highly complex international trade network while periodically trying to exterminate each other?
It requires understanding the cutthroat pragmatism of medieval capitalism. Religious ideology and territorial disputes often took a backseat to sheer economic necessity.
So it was just about the money.
Basically, the Genoese possessed the maritime logistics, the galleys, the navigational charts, the banking networks required to move goods to Venice, Genoa, and Constantinople.
And what did the Mongols have?
The Mongols possessed the raw commodities: silk, spices, grain, and most importantly, millions of human captives taken from the Eurasian interior. Neither side could monetize their assets without the other.
So they were trapped in this toxic but incredibly profitable codependency.
Exactly. Kaffa became one of the largest slave markets in the world, and the profits were astronomical.
The Genoese needed the Mongols to funnel the goods to the coast, and the Mongols needed the Genoese to pay them in Mediterranean gold and silver.
Right. They would fight violent wars over taxation rates, customs duties, and territorial boundaries around the ports. But once the peace was signed, the markets would reopen almost immediately.
Because the underlying economic engine was just too vital for either side to destroy permanently.
Exactly.
Now, out of this dual economy, the Mongol steppe and the Italian coast, a new independent state eventually splinters off.
Right. By the early 15th century, the Golden Horde is in a state of terminal decay. It is fractured by internal civil wars and has been repeatedly shattered by the devastating military campaigns of the warlord Timur.
So the central authority is collapsing.
Yes. And the local Tatar tribal leaders in Crimea, known as the Beys, recognize this. They sense an opportunity.
And this pursuit of autonomy crystallized around a figure named Haki I.
Correct. In 1441, he manages to defeat the remaining forces of the Great Horde and formally establishes the independent Crimean Khanate.
Now, the texts identify Haki as a Chinggisid prince. We need to clarify why that specific title was the ultimate political currency on the steppe.
Well, a Chinggisid prince is someone who can definitively trace their direct bloodline back to Genghis Khan.
Okay.
In the political reality of the Turco-Mongol world, this lineage was the absolute prerequisite for legitimate sovereignty. You could not simply declare yourself Khan through military might alone.
You needed the bloodline.
You needed the sacred bloodline to command the loyalty of the nomadic clans. Hakajiri had the lineage, but he also possessed immense strategic foresight.
Right, he didn't just declare independence, he restructured the state's geography.
He did. Recognizing that the open steppe in the north was impossible to defend against rival nomadic confederations, he moved the political center of gravity south.
Relocating the capital inland.
Yes, to the more defensible foothills, eventually establishing the center of power around Bakhtasari.
It was a masterstroke of statecraft, really.
Right.
He took a vulnerable peripheral province of a dying empire and forged it into a sovereign state.
Right. He leveraged the military power of the local clans and used the economic leverage of the Genoese merchants in Kaffa to fund his administration.
But survival as a small state in the late 15th century required more than just clever maneuvering. Geopolitics in the Black Sea were shifting dramatically.
The Byzantine Empire was gone. Constantinople had fallen in 1453.
And a new superpower was asserting total dominance. The newly independent Tatar state realized it needed a patron, which leads us to the Ottoman Empire.
Exactly. In 1475, the Ottoman Empire launched a massive naval and land expedition into Crimea.
Their objective was to eradicate the last vestiges of European and Christian power in the Black Sea.
And they systematically conquered the Genoese colonies, including Kaffa, and destroyed the small Christian principality of Theodoro in the mountains.
So the Ottomans took direct imperial control of the entire southern coast.
Yes. They organized it into a province known as the Kife Eyalet.
They basically cut off the head of the maritime trade network. But what about the inland Crimean Khanate? Did the Ottomans conquer them as well?
They absorbed them politically, but not through direct conquest. The Crimean Khanate accepted formal Ottoman suzerainty.
And the relationship that developed was highly unique, wasn't it?
It was. The Khanate was not treated as a subjugated tax-paying province. The Giray Khans did not pay tribute to the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul.
Instead, it functioned like a massive military mutual assistance pact.
Exactly. The Ottoman Empire was constantly expanding into Europe and Persia, and they required light cavalry.
And the Crimean Khanate provided the most elite, mobile cavalry forces in the world at that time.
They did.
The internal structure of the Khanate made this military mobilization possible, but it was incredibly complex.
It was a decentralized elective monarchy.
Elective.
Well, the Khan always had to come from the Giray dynasty to maintain that Chinggisid legitimacy, but the Khan's power was heavily checked by a council of noble clans known as the Beys.
Families like the Shirin and the Baron, they controlled their own vast territories, their own wealth, and their own armies.
Right. And these powerful families formed the Divan, or state council. The Khan could not declare war or sign treaties without their consensus.
And below the Khan, the administration was divided territorially among the royal family.
Yes. The Khalga Sultan, who was the designated heir apparent, governed the eastern portion of the peninsula, while the Nureddin administered the western sector.
You know, thinking about this structure, it reminds me of a modern corporate franchise model, but applied to a feudal military state.
How do you mean?
Well, the Ottoman Empire acts as the massive parent company, right? They hold the prime real estate on the coast, controlling all the maritime trade and the massive fortresses.
Okay, I follow.
And the Giray Khans are the regional master franchisees. The Ottomans give them immense latitude to govern the interior steppe however they see fit, provided they deliver their annual dividends.
Which is the cavalry.
Right. Sending tens of thousands of elite cavalry to fight in Ottoman wars and securing the empire's northern frontier.
That franchise analogy is deeply revealing, actually, especially when you examine the tension it created.
Tension between the state and the clans.
Exactly. The decentralized, clan-based franchise model was the Khanate's greatest tactical strength. Because power was distributed among the Beys, they could mobilize a staggering number of warriors incredibly fast.
At their peak, the Khanate could field an army of up to 80,000 highly skilled horsemen.
Which fueled the economic engine of the state. Because when they weren't fighting for the Ottomans, they were executing their own economic policy.
The raiding economy.
Yes. The historical texts are brutal on this point. The Khanate conducted massive annual raids known as harvesting the steppe deep into the territories of Poland, Lithuania, and Muscovy.
And the primary commodity they were seeking was human captives.
It was. Over the centuries, historians estimate that roughly 2 million people were captured during these raids.
2 million. How does a state even process the logistics of moving 2 million unwilling people across the Eurasian continent over several centuries?
It was a highly organized, state-sponsored industry. The Tatar cavalry would utilize ancient, hidden trails through the steppe grass to bypass border forts.
So they moved quickly.
Very quickly. They would strike rapidly, capture entire villages, and then use a system of fortified way stations to drive the captives south to the coast.
And once there,
They were sold in the massive markets of Kaffa to Ottoman, Arab, and Mediterranean buyers.
the threat was so severe that the growing state of Muscovy actually paid formal annual tribute to the Crimean Khanate for years.
just to ransom captives and buy temporary peace.
Wow. But returning to your point about the franchise model, you mentioned it also created a fatal flaw.
The flaw was the absolute inability to centralize. To survive in the modernizing world of the 17th and 18th centuries, a state needed a standing professional army equipped with modern firearms.
And a centralized bureaucracy capable of collecting standardized taxes to pay for it.
Exactly. But in Crimea, the Beys fiercely protected their autonomy. Any Khan who attempted to centralize power and tax the noble clans faced immediate rebellion.
So they were stuck.
They were. While the neighboring Russian Empire was rapidly modernizing under rulers like Peter the Great, building centralized administrations and modern artillery parks, the Crimean Khanate remained a fractured, feudal cavalry state.
They were structurally trapped in the past.
Yes.
And that lack of adaptation proved catastrophic when the primary target of their raise, the Russian Empire, finally grew powerful enough to push south and permanently solve their border security issue.
Which brings us to the late 18th century and the beginning of the end for the Khanate.
The pivotal event is the Russo-Turkish War, which raged from 1768 to 1774.
This war completely shattered the existing balance of power. The Russian military, directed by the administration of Empress Catherine the Great, inflicted crushing defeats on the Ottoman forces on land and completely destroyed the Ottoman fleet at sea.
So the Ottomans sued for peace,
resulting in the Treaty of Küçükkaynarca in 1774.
The terms of that treaty are fascinating from a legal perspective, because the treaty explicitly declared the Crimean Khanate to be an independent state, entirely free from Ottoman suzerainty.
Right. The Tatars were granted the right to elect their own Khan without interference from Istanbul.
However, Russia simultaneously demanded control of highly strategic fortresses on the peninsula, like Kerch and Yenikale.
Exactly.
If we look critically at statecraft, I want to ask you, was this declaration of an independent Crimea a genuine attempt by Russia to establish a neutral buffer state? Or was it a purely calculated bad faith maneuver designed as a stepping stone for complete annexation?
Well, examining the subsequent Russian actions, it is clear this was a masterful, calculated application of incremental absorption. Catherine the Great's administration knew that attempting to annex Crimea outright in 1774 would have likely triggered a massive, prolonged war with the Ottomans and fierce resistance from the Tatars.
So they needed to weaken them first.
Right. By forcing the Ottomans to legally renounce their suzerainty first, Russia completely isolated the Khanate geopolitically. They stripped away the defensive umbrella that had kept Crimea safe for 300 years.
They basically isolated the patient before beginning the operation, because almost immediately, Russian agents began heavily interfering in the internal politics of the newly independent state.
Yes. In 1777, Russian military pressure and financial backing secured the election of Shahin Giray as Khan.
And who is Shahin Giray?
He was a highly educated, ambitious reformer who had spent time in St. Petersburg. He immediately set about trying to drag the Khanate into the modern era.
He tries to fix the fatal flaw.
Exactly.
The sources note he attempted to implement direct state taxation. He tried to build a conscripted standing army equipped with European-style uniforms and artillery.
And he attempted to impose new civil codes that frequently clashed with traditional Islamic law.
So he was attempting to impose a Russian-style autocratic system onto a decentralized feudal society.
And you cannot simply mandate centralization overnight. His reforms directly threatened the wealth, power, and traditional liberties of the noble Beys and the nomadic Nogai clans.
So, unpredictably, the society fractured.
Well, predictably, it fractured. The traditionalists revolted violently in 1781, forcing Shahin to flee, and then they revolted again in 1782.
And this internal chaos provided the Russian Empire with the flawless legal pretext they had been engineering.
Exactly. When Russian forces marched into the peninsula to crush the rebellions, they didn't frame it as an invasion.
Of course not.
They presented themselves to the international community as peacekeepers, merely intervening to restore order and protect the legitimate, recognized sovereign, Shahin Giray.
It is an incredibly clinical dismantling of a sovereign nation.
It was.
Once the Russian military under General Alexander Suvorov had fully occupied the territory and pacified the rebels, the illusion of independence was dropped.
Prince Grigory Potemkin, who was Catherine's most trusted advisor, relentlessly lobbied her to simply dissolve the state.
He argued that the only way to permanently stop the raiding threat and secure Russia's unhindered access to the Black Sea was total absorption.
Right, and the decree was finalized on April 19, 1783, or recorded as April 8 on the Julian calendar used by Russia at the time.
Catherine the Great issued a manifesto formally annexing the Crimean Peninsula into the Russian Empire.
Shahin was pressured into abdicating his throne, and without a fleet or a patron to defend them, the Ottomans had no choice but to formally recognize the annexation in the Treaty of Constantinople in December of 1783.
The flag over the peninsula changed, but Potemkin understood that holding the territory required more than just a military garrison.
Yes. The Russian Empire immediately set about fundamentally rewiring the administration and the human geography of the landmass.
Which marks the beginning of the Russian imperial era, stretching from 1783 through the end of the 19th century.
Potemkin acted decisively to eradicate the structural remnants of Tatar power. In 1784, the territory was reorganized into the Taurida Oblast,
integrating it entirely into the Russian administrative system.
By 1802, it was upgraded to the Taurida Governorate, and the primary mechanism of control was land confiscation.
So they took the land.
The vast estates belonging to the rebellious Tatar elites, as well as crucial communal grazing lands relied upon by the pastoralists, were simply seized by the imperial state.
And how did the state use that confiscated land?
They used it as patronage. It was redistributed as massive estates to Russian nobles, military officers, and imperial officials who had aided in the conquest.
Which triggers a massive, traumatic demographic shock for the indigenous population. Fearing cultural suppression, religious persecution by an Orthodox empire, and the total destruction of their economic livelihoods through the loss of those grazing lands, a huge portion of the Crimean Tatar population chose to flee.
And the scale of the exodus was staggering. Historical estimates suggest that between 100,000 and 200,000 Crimean Tatars emigrated across the Black Sea to the Ottoman Empire in the immediate decades following 1783.
100 to 200,000.
Yes. For the Crimean Tatar people, the period following the annexation is historically remembered as the Black Century. The entire socioeconomic foundation that had sustained their culture for centuries was dismantled.
And while the indigenous population was streaming out of the peninsula, the Russian state was actively importing an entirely new population to replace them.
Catherine the Great utilized demographic engineering as a weapon of statecraft.
Right.
She issued widespread manifestos inviting settlers to move to Crimea, offering highly lucrative state-sponsored incentives.
Like what kind of incentives?
The state offered total tax exemptions for a decade. They offered exemption from military conscription and massive allotments of free land. The sources mention grants of up to 65 desiatins per household.
Okay, let's convert that measurement. 1 desiatin is roughly equal to 2.7 acres. So the Russian state was offering individual peasant households over 175 acres of free land to relocate to Crimea.
It is an enormous estate.
It is, and the incentives worked. This policy systematically and fundamentally altered the ethnic and cultural makeup of the peninsula. Hundreds of thousands of Orthodox Slavic peasants, primarily ethnic Russians and Ukrainians, were relocated to farm the northern steppes.
But the state didn't stop with just imperial subjects. They actively recruited foreign colonists.
Who did they bring in?
They brought in German Mennonites, who were known for their advanced agricultural techniques, as well as Bulgarian farmers, Greeks, and Armenians.
And they were settled in specific colonies designed to develop commercial agriculture, right? Particularly viticulture and orchards in the southern valleys.
If we look closely at the mechanism here, this was a deliberate, pragmatic tool of imperial consolidation known as Russification.
Right.
By confiscating the land of a potentially hostile indigenous population and replacing them with a patchwork of loyal settlers whose wealth was entirely dependent on the Russian state, the empire permanently anchored the territory to Moscow.
It is demographic terraforming. They ripped up the roots of a feudal nomadic society and planted an agrarian European settler colony in its place.
They did.
And the strategic necessity of holding on to that terraformed land was proven beyond a shadow of a doubt in the mid-19th century. The peninsula became the focal point of the largest international conflict between the Napoleonic Wars and World War I.
The Crimean War.
Right, fought from 1853 to 1856.
Yeah.
It was fundamentally a war about geopolitical leverage.
The Russian Empire was expanding its influence southward, threatening the collapsing Ottoman Empire. In response, a massive coalition consisting of the French Empire, The British Empire and the Ottomans invaded Crimea.
And the war proved a vital strategic truth. Whoever commands the naval bases of Crimea, specifically the deep-water ports like Sevastopol, dictates the balance of power across the entire Black Sea region.
The conflict was a brutal, industrial-scale war of attrition, mostly focused on the horrific 11-month siege of Sevastopol.
Despite putting up a massive defense, the Russian forces were eventually exhausted by the logistical nightmare of fighting an industrialized coalition.
Yes. Russia lost the war and was forced to sign the Treaty of Paris in 1856. They suffered humiliating terms, including the demilitarization of the Black Sea, but crucially, they retained physical possession of the Crimean Peninsula.
The empire was willing to concede almost anything else, but they would not surrender the peninsula itself.
Because the war completely validated their initial strategic calculus. Crimea was the geopolitical linchpin of their southern flank. Losing it would have unraveled their entire defensive posture. Following the war, securing the peninsula militarily and demographically was no longer just imperial expansion. It was viewed in St. Petersburg as a strict matter of national survival.
By the time we reach the end of our timeline, the results of that demographic terraforming are etched in stone.
They really are. The Russian imperial census of 1897 provides the hard data. The Crimean Tatar population, which had once ruled the entire peninsula, had been reduced to just 35.8% of the total population.
35.8%.
Yes. Meanwhile, the combined populations of ethnic Russians, Ukrainians, and the descendants of the various European colonists now constituted a solid demographic majority.
So the society that entered the 20th century was unrecognizable from the society that had existed a century prior.
Completely. The demographic realities established by 1897 effectively overwrote the previous thousands of years of history, and they set the stage for the intense, complex, and tragic conflicts that would consume the peninsula in the modern era.
Looking back over the sheer volume of history we have covered, it is just a relentless story of layering.
Layer upon layer.
Neanderthals, Tauri, Scythians, Greeks, Romans, Goths, Byzantines, Mongols, Genoese, Tatars, and Russians, each group laying down their own layer of blood, architecture, and culture.
It leads to a final provocative thought regarding the nature of this specific geography. Consider the paradox of the Perekop Isthmus. That tiny strip of land makes Crimea isolated enough to act as an ecological refuge, allowing groups like the Goths or the Tauri to survive for centuries hidden in the mountains. It incubates unique cultures. Yet because it commands the center of the Black Sea, it is strategically vital enough that virtually every major Eurasian empire has bankrupted themselves to conquer it. If geography truly is destiny, then Crimea's destiny is to be forever trapped in the violent tension between being an isolated sanctuary and a vital imperial prize.
Thank you for listening. History Apps. Learn history visually.